Is this one working? We are all sounded up. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. We're going to welcome our speaker, Lee Smith, in a moment. But first, a few thank yous and some announcements about some of our upcoming programs. As always, I want to thank our community supporters, everyone that helps to make everything that we do here possible, both in terms of the community institutions that support us as well as individuals that help us. Thank you very much for your support. I also want to announce that Treasures, which is part of Friends of Jewish Lifelong Learning, has a gift shop open in the back. Some of you might have seen it when you walked in or know about it. They really, much of the work that they do helps to support our program, and I want to encourage you to go shopping in their store in back as you leave this evening or other times that you come for a lecture. So some of our upcoming programs. First, I want to tell you that this Thursday, tomorrow, we are starting a new session of our Jewish Boot Camp program. If you have not yet signed up, we do still have spots Thursday evenings, 4 Thursday evenings in a row. This session, our Jewish Boot Camp session, coming up is on Jewish prayer. Why do Jews pray? What do they say? What are the origins of Jewish prayer? If you're interested in more information or in registering, please see me or Cheryl afterwards, or you can have a look at your postcard. If it's not on your seat, we have them on your way out. You can take a look. Next, we have a number of free lectures that are coming up, part of our community lecture series that we really have here. We keep them free because we want them to be accessible. We hope this will generate conversation within the community. Our next free lecture coming up is Jonathan Sarna. He's one of the sort of leading speakers from the American Jewish world of today, professor at Brandeis, and he'll be speaking on Looking Ahead, American Judaism in the 21st century. He'll be here on Wednesday, March 9th. A little plug for my own class and for a class with Brian Amkraut. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. To those of you who I haven't had a chance to meet, my name's Alana Cooper, and I direct the Jewish Lifelong Learning program here. And myself and Brian Amkraut, who directs the Siegel Lifelong Learning program, are both offering courses this semester. I encourage you to check them out. Brian's going to be teaching on baby boom Jews, American Jewry, and the legacy of counterculturalism. And I'm going to be teaching a course on Jews of Muslim lands, leaving North Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. And again, I think you probably have this all in flyers on your seats. And finally, most at hand is tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. We'll be having a talk with Lee Smith, who's with us here this evening. Tomorrow he'll be speaking on the future of U.S.-Israel relations. If you have not registered and want to come, please let us know. You're welcome by all means. And with that, I want to turn over to the business at hand, which is to welcome Lee Smith. Some of you have probably had a chance to read his bio online. We're so excited to have you here with us this evening. Lee Smith is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, and he's had a very impressive career in writing and publishing with a variety of journals and magazines, including the Hudson Review, the Echo Press, Grand Street, GQ, and Talk Magazine. He's currently a senior editor at the Weekly Standard and also served as editor-in-chief of the Voice Literary Supplement, which is the Village Voice's national monthly literary magazine. Lee Smith has been a guest on radio and television, including Fox News, the National Public Radio. He's a prolific writer, contributing articles on Arab and Islamic affairs to, among other publications, the New York Times, the New Republic, the Weekly Standard, the Boston Globe, and Wired. His book on Arab societies, The Strong Horse, Power, Politics, and the Clash of Arab Civilizations, which was published by Doubleday in January 2010. Lee currently lives in Washington, D.C., and came in this morning from there. Please give him a warm Cleveland welcome.
All right. Can you hear me okay? Is this all right now? No? Should I speak up or turn this up further? How do I turn it up more? It should be on. It looks to be on.
Yeah, just a little.
All right. I'll just speak a little louder. I'll try not to mumble into my tie, as I often do. Is this okay? If you can't hear me, though, if I start to drone on too much, and with that in mind, by the way, I hope not to drone on too much. I believe we're going to go for about an hour and a half or something like that. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to speak for about half an hour. I'll probably run over that a bit, but I wanted to give my general understanding of what's happening in the region, in particular what's happened as a consequence of the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. But first of all, I wanted to say how happy I am to be here, and I want to thank you so much for coming, and I very much appreciate it, and I wanted to say thank you to Alana and Cheryl for inviting me. So thank you all kindly. I look forward to both this evening and tomorrow. I hope you'll come tomorrow too for another interesting conversation. Also, as you may have heard in my biography, I've had a wide range. I've worked at a wide ideological range of publications, from the Village Voice, which is pretty far to the left, still is, and the Weekly Standard, which, to be generous, I would say is center-right, certainly more to the right. So what I want to try to do, what I want to try to establish is a lot of the things I will be saying are not ideological. I want to try to present as much as possible to draw you an accurate picture of what the region really looks like. When I move into analysis, there's nothing that's going to go on over my head, so you'll know it's analysis. But I will try to identify, say, this is how it looks to me. This is what seems to be going on to me, and this is how I read it. And so allow me to start with this precisely, that the way that I think it is best to understand the Iranian nuclear deal, I think it's part of a larger regional realignment that the president sought with Iran. Now, you know, as you all know, since 1979, since the Islamic Revolution, and since the takeover of the U.S. Embassy, it's been perhaps the major collective dream of the American foreign policy establishment to have historical reconciliation with Iran. And even though certainly during the Bush years there was a lot of, I'm just going to pour some water while we're speaking, during the Bush years there was a lot of talk about how the Bush administration was foolish. He left opportunities to negotiate with Iran on the table. That wasn't actually accurate. And in fact, every administration since the Carter administration had tried to reach out to the Iranians. They thought that in itself, it was a good thing. This president thought it was a good thing for particular reasons. He looked at the Middle East in a way. Allow me to say this: the Middle East is a very confused and in many ways a very damaged part of the world. And I think that both in order to understand the region and to sorry, I'm trying to speak as loud as I can. It's a difficult part of the world, and if you expect too much of it, it's going to be an especially hard place. And I think that over the course of 70 years, American policymakers have had a pretty good reading on the Middle East. They've understood different flaws, they've understood different challenges, they've understood different problems. And in fact, one of the things that I will say is if you look now at the Arab-Israeli conflict and what people still today, not as much as they did 5 years ago, but what people still often refer to as the most important conflict in the region and the crisis once solved, which will make it easier to solve all the conflicts in the region. If you look at it now, the best way to understand is in context with the Syrian crisis, where closing in on nearly 500,000 dead over 5 years, that barely approaches the number of casualties. I don't mean to sneer at the number of Israeli and Arab dead since 1948 or even before. What I'm trying to do is give a context and say the idea that the Arab-Israeli issue warranted so much attention was a luxury that was afforded by the fact of American power in the Middle East. It was American power in the Middle East and the fact that the American policymakers underwrote the structure of the Middle East, that they were able to look at this crisis and say, this is the worst thing that's happening in the Middle East. Even before that, we'd seen plenty of violence in the Middle East. We'd seen a civil war in Algeria. We saw a civil war in Lebanon. Nonetheless, people continue to point to the Arab-Israeli crisis. What's happened now, and I'll swing back around to this shortly, but what's happened now with what is actually, I believe, an American absence, this is part of what's happening in Syria. This is a large part of what's happening in Syria. And this was also part of the reason to strike the agreement with Iran, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. I was there in July when it was signed in Vienna. I think that everyone knew it was everyone agreed that it was a historic occasion, it was a momentous occasion, but not everyone agreed it was a good agreement. I will again identify myself as an opponent of the Iran deal. I thought it was a very bad idea, not just because of the actual terms of the deal, but because of what I perceive to be, again, the president's strategic goals behind the Iranian nuclear deal. I believe that what the president saw was, again, I think that this administration looks at the Middle East in a particular way. I think that they believe that there's not a lot of upside, not for the United States, and not politically for this particular president. And they have a point. George W. Bush was wrong about a great many things. And when you wage, this is something that we read in the history books all the time, when you wage a war and you don't win it, things change. Things change quite dramatically and quite drastically. And in some ways, the Obama campaign was certainly a referendum on the Bush years, but also Obama foreign policy was a referendum and was a revision of the Bush years. As it turned out, however, it was not just about the Bush years. It was about American foreign policy in general. 70 years of American foreign policy. I want to argue that the different structures that have been in place in the region, from the American alignment with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I just want to make sure it's not on a slant, so it's not going to fall off. I think it's okay. With the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 1944, as the Second World War was drawing to a close, to the formation of NATO, Turkey as a NATO partner, as a member of NATO, and certainly to America's alliance with Israel. Certainly most vividly after most vividly during the 1973 war. All of these were the careful construction of American policymakers who had to deal with a number of flawed allies in different ways. I think it's easy to look and see how the Saudis are flawed. It's not, as Obama has pointed out, the Saudis in many ways are an incoherent regime where Saudi Arabia and Iran are different because they both are responsible for a lot of terrorism, except in almost entirely the opposite ways. With Iran, it's actually a matter of state foreign policy. This is what the IRGC Quds Force is for. It's actual state foreign policy. With Saudi Arabia, it's a function of the incoherence of the state. You have, 5,000 Saudi princes. Some of them are bad people. And they all have a lot of money. And some of them spend a lot of money on bad causes. Nonetheless, there is no doubt that Saudi Arabia has done many bad things in the region and many bad things around the world. It's a problematic actor. And certainly, the Obama administration looked at Turkey and in some ways it believed that Turkey was going to be a much better ally than it was. And then at different points in the relationship, certainly with the outbreak of the war in Syria, the United States or the administration looked and saw that Turkey was not as helpful a partner as it thought it would be. Certainly with Israel, I think a lot of the ways that people interpret this administration, its relation with Israel, is unfair. I don't think that the president dislikes Israel. I think he doesn't have an especially warm feeling for Israel, and I think that this is not a surprising thing. There are plenty of people there are especially plenty of intellectuals who have this same feeling. What's rare is that someone with that idea occupies the White House. The other thing that distinguishes this administration from previous White Houses is, again, it didn't see Israel in the same way that other White Houses have. Certainly Henry Kissinger, Henry Kissinger and George W. Bush saw Israel in a very different way, that Israel would be a powerful component and do what we call offshore balancing in terms of American foreign policy. This administration didn't. This administration believed that Israel was more often than not a nuisance. It was causing trouble. It was fighting all the time, and this is what was getting people mad around the region. So the purpose then about realigning American interest, the most important thing to keep in mind is that the Obama White House wanted to draw down its position in the Middle East. Again, because it thought it was a problematic part of the world. About the pivot to Asia, it thought, as former National Security Advisor Tom Donilon, I believe that Donilon was the National Security Advisor after James Jones. But as Donilon said, I think he was the Chief of Staff before that, but Donilon said, we're overinvested in the Middle East. We're spending too many resources here. We spend too much time here. There are other parts of the world. I think that this is exactly how Obama felt, that Obama wanted to get out. He saw the losses in Iraq, he saw the losses in Afghanistan, and he wanted to get out of the region further. Now, to look at regional realignment, what they mean by that is, if you take down some of the other allies, you need to balance out the region. If you're leaving, how do you balance out the region? And actually, that a very interesting example. An interesting predecessor, which was the Twin Pillars policy. This was the idea that the Brits had in the 1960s, when the Brits realized that they were out of money and they would not be able to sustain their position in the Middle East any longer. Their idea then was the Twin Pillars will be Saudi Arabia and Iran. These are two wealthy nations. Both allied with America, and this was, of course, the Shah's Iran, not the Islamic Republic. The Brits never really employed the Twin Pillar policy because they were out much sooner than they expected. But the people who did employ or tried to employ the Twin Pillar policy was the Nixon administration. What the Nixon administration found out very quickly, though, was Saudi Arabia couldn't really carry the ball. It was only Iran that served as an American pillar. And we've seen this happen again and again. This is part of the issue when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and the United States had to go in there and protect Saudi Arabia. We saw it with Osama bin Laden. The Saudis could not even protect themselves from one of their own sons, Osama bin Laden. So the Saudis in many ways are a weak link. And that's one thing the Nixon White House found out very quickly. The way the Obama administration figured it out, and he has said this, it's important to keep in mind that this president, a very thoughtful and intellectual president, but compared to other presidents, his actual policies are not as, they haven't been stated in the same way. We all know what George W. Bush thought about the Middle East, his plans for the Middle East. He went out and made a number of statements, agree or disagree about the freedom agenda, but he went out and made a series of speeches about what he thought was going to happen in the Middle East, what he wanted to have happen. This president's very different. This president has given very clear pictures of what he wants, but in a different way. So you have to look at different interviews and different articles, different columnists. David Remnick, Jeffrey Goldberg, David Ignatius, Thomas Friedman. These are all people who speak to the president in terms of foreign policy. In a New Yorker article, I believe it was January 2014, he spoke with David Remnick talking about forging a new geopolitical equilibrium in the Middle East. And what that meant was that the Sunni and Shia, Saudi Arabia and Iran would be balanced off of each other. There would still be conflict, there would still be competition, but we wouldn't see the amount of wars that we see now. We wouldn't see the amount of violence we see now. What he needed to do then was he needed to be able to bring the Iranians in to the security architecture of the Middle East. To do that, to make room for them, he had to push traditional American allies out a little bit further. And this is what we saw happening certainly since 2009. People wondered why he would be beating up on Netanyahu. People wondered why he was saying the different things about the Saudis that he was saying. In some ways, I believe that he was trying to show his bona fides to the Iranians and trying to prove that it was safe to come in. He meant them no harm, and of course we know the president has been writing letters to the supreme leader basically since he first came to office. The president also showed his bona fides in many other ways. The first test was June 2009. You'll remember the likely fraudulent presidential elections which brought Mahmoud Ahmadinejad back to power that sent Iranian protesters out into the streets, the Green Movement. Lots of Americans and others around the world were astonished that the United States wouldn't say anything about these people living under a tyranny, some of whom were already being shot in the streets, captured, tortured. Why wouldn't the President of the United States say anything? As we found out later in another article also in the New Yorker, that the reason they didn't want to move, the reason the President didn't want to do anything, and the reason he did a bit but very late, because they were trying to make a deal with the regime. They were trying to engage the Iranian regime. They didn't want the regime to believe that they were taking the side of the demonstrators. The White House, the President wanted Khamenei and the real hardliners in the regime. I'll come back to the hardliners and moderates thing momentarily. He wanted them to feel comfortable. He wanted them to be able to trust him. Because this is one of these standard ideas, that the reason there has been no deal, it's not because of the Iranians, it's because of the Americans. The Americans are the untrustworthy ones. But again, I do want to say that lots of times the United States has reached out. And there are many presidents who have tried to reach out. The Clinton administration was very optimistic about reaching out. And then there was the Khobar Towers bombing, and they knew the Iranians were behind it. They didn't make it public, but they knew the Iranians were behind it. I think that this president understood very well. I think one of the things he believed, and he's right, if you want to make a deal with the Iranians, you have to hold your nose. You have to have a very strong stomach, because they're going to do something to push you away from the table. Again, there were different communications between the Bush administration and the Iranians and different Iranian allies. But once the Iranians started their IED program, killing American forces in Iraq, there was no way the Bush administration could deal with the Iranians. Not at that level, in that way. Anyway, this was the first test for the Obama administration. If they could do that, if they could stomach seeing what was happening in the streets of Iranian cities. I want to argue that the next big test was in March 2011 with the Syrian revolution, when the Syrians started taking to the street. But I just want to cut very quickly to the basic point. If you want to know what the consequences of the Iran deal are, look at Syria. That's the consequences of the Iran deal. And look at everything that's happening in Syria. I just want to go to that and then come back around. In Syria, we have both a genocide. We have a multi-actor war that includes both states and non-state actors like Hezbollah, like ISIS. It's bringing in other foreign actors now, like Russia. It's an extremely volatile, dangerous situation. The other thing it's doing is it's giving rise to a refugee crisis that is threatening to destabilize a key American partner and key American ally all throughout Europe. We can certainly debate about how the Europeans are handling the refugee crisis, and I think in some ways they might be able to do a little better job of it. Nonetheless, the reality is they are who they are. And what we're seeing is a major crisis which is issuing right now from the Syria conflict. I wondered when the Syria crisis, the Syria war first broke out, how the president didn't see it. The president didn't see it the way so many other people saw it. The former commandant of the Marine Corps, General James Mattis, said, yes, certainly taking down Bashar al-Assad, he's the Iranians' only Arab ally. This would be the biggest strategic blow against Iran in 25 years. Many of my friends and I in Washington thought the same things, like, doesn't the president see this? If he wants to make a deal with the Iranians, one of the best things to do would be to take a bullet out of their chamber, and that's Iran. Well, no one is saying land American forces. The very least we're saying is, why not arm the rebels? Help the rebels to help themselves. It's a typical Cold War play. We did it a lot during the Cold War years, and we had some success with it. Why is this beyond them now? Why aren't they doing it now? As it turned out, the president did see it strategically. He just saw the other side of it. Everyone at a certain point in his cabinet, aside from Dennis McDonough, there's a fascinating and really important piece in the New York Times from October 2013, I'm pretty sure, 2013, where they're talking about debates over Syria, how to deal with the Syria conflict. And at a certain point, everyone in the room, Hillary Clinton, David Petraeus, Leon Panetta, everyone in the room, everyone in the president's national security cabinet says, we have to arm the rebels. We have to. The president is described as sitting off aloofly in a corner, texting on his BlackBerry and chewing gum. I think it was probably not an entirely... the image is probably a little harsh, but the fact is interesting. The fact is fascinating for a number of reasons. First of all, that's how decisions are made in this White House. This is a very important thing to keep in mind. When you hear different confusing things, when the State Department says one thing and the president says something else, it's because no one else knows what's going on. It's the president who knows, the president and a few advisors. That's it. Now, foreign policy is always made by the president in the White House. But one of the things the White House is supposed to do is coordinate with the bureaucracies, the CIA, the State Department, the Pentagon, so everyone knows what the policy is. Everyone knows that they're on the same page. That's not the case with this White House. And one of the reasons it's not the case with this White House is because the president perceived correctly that a lot of people in the American foreign policy establishment the blood would drain from their face if they knew the kind of rapprochement that he wanted with the Iranians. Now, again, even though it's been a collective dream of the foreign policy establishment, everyone has nonetheless been wary. It's easy when you're outside of it. It's important to remember, Dick Cheney, before Cheney came to office as vice president, when he was still running Halliburton, he said, we need to dump these Iran sanctions. We need American companies back in there. When he got into office again, it turned into a very different thing. So it's a different thing when policymakers are outside of government and then when they come back in. So that's one reason that this president plays things very closely to his chest. Let me come back to Syria. I say that this was another key test because Because again, there were two different things that would have compelled the president, as it compelled his chief policymakers to argue on behalf, not landing troops, but on behalf of arming proxies, on behalf of setting up a no-fly zone or a buffer zone. There was the humanitarian catastrophe that was unfolding. What's happening in Syria, what's been happening in Syria since March 2011, it's appalling. And what we're seeing with the refugee crisis is, this is not about ISIS. None of this has to do with ISIS. It's all about Assad. Assad has been targeting Sunni Arabs since March 2011. This war started as a peaceful protest movement. Assad sent his people out to the streets to shoot people who were marching, protesting, singing in the streets of Syrian cities. That's how it started. And that's what's been happening for 5 years. So certainly there's a lot of rationale there to prevent humanitarian catastrophe. But again, it was also a strategic issue. If the president wanted to deal with the Iranians, if he wanted to sit and get a really good deal from them, he'd say, here's how we're going to do it. Here's how we play the game. Here's how Americans play the game. Here's my hand. I told you we were going to bring down Assad, and we did. And here's how else we can make you work around the region. Now, we don't want you having a nuclear weapons program. That's how it's going to happen. I'm of course, just play acting here. But there's many different ways that the president might have used this. He might have used a real thing in the world to sit with the Iranians and get a better deal. But that was not the issue, or that was not his concern. His concern was the Iranians may walk away from the table. And that was his key foreign policy ambition, initiative, was to have this deal with the Iranians. Again, keep in mind, it was not just about, in a way, all of the questions that we ask, the way we talk about when we talk about sanctions, when we talk about, well, how close are they to break out? What's going to happen? I mean, we can talk about that. There are probably many of you in this room who know those details much better than I do. Right? Are they going to break out in 15 years? What happens? And how much did they really ship out all the uranium? These are not the important issues. The most important issue was, the way I see it, is that the nuclear weapons deal was let me see if I can come up with a perfect figure for it. In a way, it was a token of good faith. And another way, it was a document. It's the document on which a new alignment in the region has been built. Rapprochement, in some ways it's rapprochement between the United States and Iran. In some ways it's more than rapprochement. In some ways there's been active American-Iranian coordination in the region. For instance, when the Iraqi army, which wasn't really the Iraqi army, because it was also had a number of Iranian-backed Iraqi militias, and Haj Qasem Soleimani was at the head of the charge to liberate Tikrit. That could not have happened without American air support. That was one time the United States and the Iranians were actively working together. We've seen in other parts of the region as well, where the American intelligence community shares intelligence about Sunni fighters with the Lebanese Armed Forces military intelligence, which is controlled by Hezbollah. That's a Hezbollah asset. That's all it is. So here we have, again, the United States working with an Iranian asset, Hezbollah. It happened, if you look at what has happened in Syria, the United States, we are backing a number of different rebels. The Pentagon program, though, the reason is, I mean, think about it. Remember a couple of months ago when they were on the Hill, they were making fun of the fact the Pentagon only sent 5 or 6 fighters out into the field. Well, the reason they only sent 5 or 6 fighters out into the field was because they made anyone who got American training and American arms, they made them sign a document saying they were not going to fight against the guy who had killed their friends and families. They would only fight against ISIS. They would never turn their arms against Assad. Really, it's astonishing they got 5 or 6 people to sign that paper at all. It's really astonishing. So, again, there's been active coordination and sometimes more between the United States and Iranian allies throughout the region. And again, I am gonna wrap this up in a second because we can move to questions. But my book, The Strong Horse, what I argue is that it's not particular to the Middle East. It is now. This is something that we've seen all around the world. As Americans, I believe we're extremely fortunate in that our political lives are free from the violence, and coercion that besets most communities around the world still today, and has historically. In the Middle East, that's still the case. There's always going to be different strongmen vying for power. One of the things that we should understand now is that in the Middle East, certainly since the Cold War, but you can make an argument, you can certainly since the fall of the Soviet Union, but since the 40s, the United States was the strong horse in the Middle East. It was the United States. It was the military might of the United States and its particular security architecture that kept the violence to a minimum. Because now we see, without the United States, now that the United States is not playing a role in the Middle East, that the United States has withdrawn, we see what the violence looks like. We see what Syria is. We see what happens when other actors go in there, like the Russians, like the Iranians, the way they operate, and how this is compared to how the United States managed the region. This, in the most colorful and vivid form imaginable, is the consequence of the Iran deal. If it's not just, as I argue, not just about the nuclear weapons agreement, but it's about a regional realignment where American allies are rejiggered, Israel and Saudi Arabia are pushed out a little bit, Iran is brought in much more, and while the United States itself steps back, that's the consequence of that regional realignment. What the region looks like right now. And Syria is the place where we see this most vividly. It may be, if it means American withdrawal, if it means America taking a step back, this is going to affect other places as well, other parts of the region. I think that probably it'll be best if we, I can talk more specifically as well about what this Iran deal, what the Iran deal and what regional realignment means for American interests going on down the line, and what it means for Israel. So I'll just talk about those two things very quickly, and then move on to questions. This has been an extremely consequential president. There's a lot of between Donald Trump. I think is there any Republican right now who says, I think Kasich is the only one who says that we're not going to, but correct me if I'm wrong, who says that we're going to crush Obamacare. That's the first thing I'm going to do when I'm in office. We're going to get rid of Obamacare. Whether that's possible or not, it remains to be seen. What is not possible? The different instruments, the different structures that have fallen into place now over the last several years. It's not a matter of just going in. Jeb Bush was actually right about this. It's not a matter of saying, I don't like the Iran deal, I'm going to tear it up. It's not just that. If you look at the different things that have happened, it's going to be what position does the United States have now in Syria? Now that the Russians are there, what can the United States do? Is that the first thing that a president is going to want to do in office? Yeah, I think we need to take on the Russians. That's a good idea. In Syria. That's not going to happen. The easy things that will be easy to fix is whoever's going to be president, that'll be one of the first things they'll do. Whether it's Hillary, well, maybe not if it's Donald Trump, but certainly if it's Hillary, what's the first thing? One of the first things, maybe the first trip she makes abroad is she goes to Jerusalem. She meets with Bibi. She holds her nose, even though she's given him a hard time a lot. And she says, don't worry, things are going to be fantastic now. So you can fix these relations. She can go to Saudi. She can speak with King Salman. She can meet with Erdogan. I'm not saying Hillary's going to be the president. I'm just saying, let's say it's Hillary, whoever it is. You can do all these things. You can fix, you can adjust different relations. But your actual position in the region, remember, this was a position built up over the course of 70 years. Regional realignment. As this president has implemented this, this is going to be an extremely, extremely difficult thing it will never go back to the way it was before. That can't happen. It can change from the way it is now, but it's not going to go back. Relations can go back, right? About Israel, I'll just say very quickly, the most important things for Israel, and this is a consequence of the Iranian nuclear deal. The most important thing for Israel coming out of the Syrian war is, as some of you may know, Israel has been a guy I met in Turkey. It's actually very moving. You guys will see. I hope you read this story when it comes out in tablet in March to commemorate the anniversary of the beginning of the Syrian war. But a friend of mine, a Syrian guy, he's writing a long article thanking Israel, because he's like, all of the Arabs, everyone around us, they don't care, but we go to the border, our people go to the border, and the Israelis treat them. The Israelis help them. They bring them to hospitals. It's very sweet. It's a really moving piece, so I hope you read it. But the Israelis are doing not only humanitarian work during the course of the Syrian war, they're also collecting intelligence, because they're working with a number of these different Sunni figures. They're working with a number of the Sunni groups, and the Sunni groups are doing a very important thing. And this is one of the reasons why the Israelis are happy to work with them. They're helping them keep Hezbollah and the IRGC off of the Golan border on the Syrian side. The Israelis are extremely and rightly concerned that the Iranians are trying to open up a second front, not only from South Lebanon, but also from the Golan. And this is why, as you remember, in January 2015, why there was the attack up there that killed some of the IRGC figures, and also Imad Mughniya's son, Jihad Mughniya. I was in Lebanon at the time. Because the Israelis, they knew what they were doing up there. They were trying to create another base, to create a front, to point at Israel. So that right now is Israel's major concern. The Iranians opening up a front there. The actual nuclear weapons program, that's a big deal, but that's not the most important thing on their minds right now. The most important thing on their mind, the way I see it, and from what I've heard from different people, speaking with different people, is their concern is Iran's advanced position through the Syrian war. Will they try? They're going to keep trying to get up to the Golan. And one thing you should look at is Russia. Russians and the Israelis have. Oh, the Israelis, believe me, they understand Russians. They know how to deal with Putin. Putin doesn't hate Jews. It's fine. Maybe Putin's a little more transparent than Obama. At least we know what Putin wants. The people who are on the ground, when the Russians are striking, when the Russians are flying missions in the air, the people who are taking and holding ground, it's Hezbollah. That's who it is. I'm not saying that this is exactly how it's going to look on the Israeli border. I'm just saying the optimism that a lot of people have right now for this relationship, I think it might be a little misplaced, and we'll give it a little more time and see what happens. But that's certainly a concern too. So I'm just going to bring this part of it to a close, and I hope and trust you will have questions or angry rejoinders. So please, if you have do you want to call? Or
yeah, we have mics. Cheryl and I are both walking around with mics, and we'll give you the floor.
Thank you. My name is Michael Goldstein. I write occasionally for American Thinker.
Okay.
I'm concerned about the Republican presidential candidates who all said in the last debate, I think it was January 28th, it wasn't the last debate, but they all said words to the effect that early in my term in office, I'm going to destroy ISIS. We're going to get rid of them. Okay. And one of the things I brought up is, okay, and what's next? But nobody on the press panel asked that question, so nobody answered that question. So if ISIS is destroyed, you're practically leaving the field to Iran, to Hezbollah, to Assad, to the Russians, I think. And there's no countervailing force to Iran, which is basically what President Obama seems to want anyway. And I don't know that I want to see a Republican president do that, but I think somebody who's going to be the next president has to, I'd like your opinion on this. I think somebody who's going to be the next president has to begin now putting together an A-team of people to develop a strategy about what to do in that area. And I don't know if it's happening or not. What do you think?
No, I think it's an excellent question, and I agree entirely. I mean, I've been arguing for some time. ISIS is extremely gory and bloody, and it's not about being pro or anti-ISIS, but the amount of attention that they've generated for themselves. Again, I'm sorry, it's the Middle East. It's horrific, right? So the idea that ISIS, their blood and gore, is worse than the blood and gore of the Saudis executing people in the middle of Riyadh, or the Iranians like throwing gay teenagers off of construction cranes. I mean, this is preposterous. We should be looking at what are the strategic issues. If we're going to base it on who sheds blood in the nastier ways, it's going to be a little tough. But I mean, in terms of strategic issues, ISIS is not a problem for the United States. ISIS is just not a problem. And the ISIS campaign is phony insofar as we all know the first step in defeating ISIS, because that's how the surge worked. I mean, I'm not entirely sure that I would defend a permanent surge and a permanent presence in Iraq. But what I'm saying is the way the surge worked was they were able to get, the Bush administration was able to get Sunni buy-in. They were able to get the Sunni tribes to turn on al-Qaeda in Iraq because they also said, we're going to go after the Shia at the same time. Don't worry, we'll go after them at the same time. What the Obama administration doing is entirely different. They're not saying we'll go after the Shia at the same time. They're not saying we'll go after the Hashd al-Shab. They're not saying, don't worry, we'll calm down. We'll put the central government in Baghdad in order, and we're going to topple Assad. Don't worry, we're going to push the Iranians back. They're not saying that at all. They're telling the Sunnis, the way the Sunnis hear it is, the administration is saying, we want you to fight a Sunni civil war in which the Iranians will pick up the pieces. How does that sound to you? That's not going to happen. So that's why I argue that the ISIS campaign is anti-ISIS campaign. It's phony. Everyone in the region knows how this is fought, or how the first step that you must take. And so they haven't done it yet. Are people doing that in different campaigns? I mean, I know some people who are working for campaigns who are making that argument. Are politicians saying it? Are politicians hearing it? I'm not sure. But we know it's so public right now, and the administration has done a very good. The ISIS coalition is a way to help pave over regional realignment with Iran, right? Rapprochement with Iran. Iran can help us against ISIS. ISIS is the problem. Iran is actually, they're helping, because we have a shared interest in fighting these crazy Sunni jihadis. That's what the ISIS campaign is. Again, if they were really serious about fighting this bloody jihadi group in the middle of the Fertile Crescent, we know how it starts. It's not happening. Does that?
Thank you for agreeing.
All right.
Thank you for being here. We appreciate your insights.
Thank you. It's very kind.
Would you care to expand on the impact of the Iran agreement, specifically as it affects Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt?
Well, the Saudis are certainly very concerned. The Jordanians are concerned as well. But I mean, it's really the Saudis who the Iranians are pointing at. right? So they're the people who are most concerned. And one of the problems for the Saudis was, it's very interesting actually, because I just went to Turkey and Lebanon in January. And the Turks are furious. They're furious about the Iran deal. They're furious about the fact that the United States is partnered with a U.S. designated foreign terrorist organization, the PKK. But you don't hear that much coming from the Turks. And you don't hear that much coming from the Saudis either. We all know that the Israelis fought this publicly, right? It was very interesting. And the Israelis, I know, they wanted to, I spoke to different diplomats in Washington, they wanted the Saudis to argue alongside them. And the Saudis said, we'd love to, you know, we'd love to, we can't though, because we're not you. You guys are like family with them, so it's really a family argument. The person who comes in next, you're going to be okay with, or whatever. It's like, people don't like us around town. Right? Or the American public does not like them. They're liked in Washington. The American public doesn't feel the same way about Saudi. So we're going to bite our lip, or bite our tongue rather, and we're not going to say anything. But the Saudis are, they've done more. You remember after the Iranians torched the 2 Saudi diplomatic facilities in Iran, the Saudis were like, this is ridiculous. We've had all we can take. The Iranians fired off a ballistic missile test here. The Americans aren't doing anything. They said they were going to push back on sanctions. They're not doing a thing. This is preposterous. So the Saudis have started to make some more noise. But certainly nothing like the Israelis have. Everyone knows that the Israelis, and it's not just the Prime Minister of Israel, the opposition as well, everyone has been very much against this Iran deal, and everyone is very concerned by it. But what does it actually mean for the Saudis? I mean, I assume, as many people do, I'm sure there's not something new you're hearing, I assume the Saudis will themselves go for a nuclear weapon if they don't already have one. I mean, right, they paid for the Pakistani program. Who knows if 10 years ago they didn't say, oh yeah, and we want you to, and here's another $500 million to make sure that you put that one on this special shelf for us, next to our blue label scotch and our cigars. We want the nuclear weapon in there too, on that shelf. That may already be the case, but I think that's the way they're going to go. I was surprised though, speaking with different Turkish analysts who are fairly close to the government, they said, yeah, the Turks don't want a nuclear weapon. I'm like, really? I mean, now we still have, I believe, parts of our arsenal there, so that may be why. But I was surprised to hear the Turks don't want one, because I always assumed that Turkey would be, soon after Saudi, they would be there. The Egyptians, if that's what you were pointing at, the Egyptians are in big trouble. The Egyptians don't have money. The Egyptians aren't that worried about Iran, but the Egyptians are broke. And the Saudis have so many expenditures now. A lot of people think that the Saudi regime is in trouble because of the price of oil. The actual regime is fine. I mean, the regime is perfectly healthy shape and might even be getting healthier, not through money, but through, the deputy crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman. A lot of people seem to like. Even I think people in the White House like him. No, the Saudis are going to start cutting people off. They cut off the Lebanese. They're mad at the Lebanese because of their shenanigans. They cut them off with money. I think they cut off $5 billion. The Egyptians, and their expenditures are Syria and Yemen and Egypt, $10 to $12 billion a year. Eventually, they're going to cut them off, probably sooner rather than later. And then what happens to Egypt? So yeah, Egypt is not going to be moving toward. They might want one, but they're not going to be able to afford it. And Egypt is in trouble. That's how I.
Several minutes ago, you used the phrase strategic interest. Certainly, one of our strategic interests and one of the Israeli strategic interests is to prevent the Iranians from obtaining a nuclear weapon. If you look at just that issue, which is at least the stated purpose of the agreement, in what way do you think this does not achieve that within the time period that is stated?
I mean, the president himself, I may ask you to clarify some of your phrasing, but I'll just say that the president himself has said that even with the deal, within 15 years...
I understand
yeah.
why I put the caveat within the time period specified.
and acknowledged by the administration. In what way do you think that this agreement does not achieve that strategic interest?
First of all, I'm not sure that's a strategic interest. I think there's been a lot of debate. I think there's a lot of debate in the White House about exactly. Look, I mean, first of all, if you want a regional realignment with a country, you can't deny them their crown jewel, right? You can't say, well, yes, we want alignment with you.
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about what Bibi Netanyahu said was Israel's strategic interest, which is absolutely essential that the Iranians not acquire a nuclear weapon. This administration has said the same thing. Everyone has acknowledged what the issues are going out beyond 15 years. My question is, within that time period, and it is indeed a strategic interest,
Why do I think this deal doesn't achieve that?
within that time period, yes.
I mean, I think if you look simply at the inspections regime, we don't have a very clear picture on what the Iranians are doing. That's the fundamental issue. The PMDs, which were never resolved, we stepped all over the IAEA to make them eat it. We have no idea, because it's not on the record, we have no idea. The reason why the deal was impossible without the PMDs is you can't benchmark something. They needed to be able to benchmark something. They needed to know what the regime was doing beforehand, to know what they were doing now, and to know what they're not doing. Without being able to do that, inspections are irrelevant. That's why the PMDs were so important. That's the major problem with the actual agreement. If you're talking about implementation, or rather that would be the technical issue, or technical implementation. Political implementation is when the administration has promised to push back when Iran does different things. The administration has pushed back on nothing. That's the political aspect of it. They've done nothing. So when Iran pushes it further and further, and if they violate something with the program, what will the administration do? They've shown they're not going to do anything.
Do you think that the report that the plutonium reactor is totally disabled is incorrect?
I don't know. There are other issues at stake that are equally important. I don't know. I really don't know. I'm not an intelligence service. I don't know. Why? Why is that an important thing, you think?
Okay, we're gonna move on to the next question.
Yeah, I'm also going to ask you a question about the Iran deal. I'm intrigued by your assigning somewhat diminished value to the nuclear part of the Iran deal in the context of larger political trends, and would like to ask for your view on the fact that most of the Iranian nuclear inventory was in the form of uranium hexafluoride, a gaseous form, at 20% U-235, which means that had the Iranians kept that inventory, there would be a clear path to taking it north of 80% U-235 and making it highly enriched uranium, and thus weapons grade. They moved that inventory to Russia, at least we believe they moved that inventory to Russia, thus taking away from them, at least in the short term, the capability to have a rapid path to making bomb material. Could you put that in context relative to your other remarks? What you see the significance of that activity?
I'm not sure I'm following.
Okay, Iranians had a big pile of uranium and they moved it to Russia. Now they don't have as much to make a bomb. Is that significant or not?
No, I don't see it as significant. And first of all, as I said, I don't think the nuclear weapons deal was the most important part of what we've seen happening since 2009. And I think the Iranians probably feel the same. I think the Iranians are probably in the same place. We've separated this so much, saying there's the Iranian nuclear weapons program, which is an issue, and then there's other issues. The Iranians don't see it like that. For the Iranians, the nuclear weapons program, it's another asset. It's the crown jewel, but it's another asset for the regime. Just like their position in Syria, just like their position in Iraq, just like their advanced positions around the rest of the region. I mean, if you're asking technically, has their actual ability to make a bomb been slowed down? That's my understanding. That's my understanding from the people who look at this very closely. Yeah, I think that's what's happened. I think the Israelis certainly believe that the Iranians have shipped this stuff out, and they're happy with that aspect of the implementation. But there's other parts of it they're extremely concerned about, which I think that they break off from. It's like, no, they've definitely done this. The administration is right. The Iranians have sent this out, and that's great. But we have a lot of other concerns.
Hi, I would like to take issue with your statement that that the Israelis are unhappy with this nuclear deal. In fact,
I just said they're happy that they're sending out that they've actually shipped this out.
They've made larger statements, and those statements come from former heads of Mossad, Shin Bet, IDF, and even the current IDF, and the head of the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission. They're all saying that Israel is much more secure in general terms as a result of that. And if those people, may I finish, please? May I finish my statement? If those people who know much more than anybody on that security issue of Iran's nuclear program are saying that, it seems to me it's pretty presumptuous for us to say, no, it ain't true. So I have another comment, but please, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Right. As we all know, Israeli politics is it's a very tough affair where lots of people are fighting all the time about lots of different things. We know that, for instance, one of the former heads of the Mossad was very upset at the prime minister, thought he was a lunatic, and was very upset at also the then defense minister, Ehud Barak. He thought they were wrong. Everyone has reputations on the line. There are lots of internal fights here. What they said represents a part of a truth. Does that mean that that's exactly what happened? I'm sorry, no, I don't think so. It represents a part of a truth. It's a political truth. Is that exactly what's going on with the nuclear weapons program? Are they describing exactly what Israel's situation is? No, they're describing a part of how they see it. So, no, what Avi Dichter says, I'm sorry, what Meir Dagan says, his interpretation of it, no, I don't believe that. I don't think that's a good way to go on this. Any guy who stands up, who's interviewed by the New York Times or Washington Post, or who has a podium somewhere in Washington, says, it's great for us, don't worry, Bibi's an idiot. No, I'm sorry. That's internal Israeli politics. And it's fascinating. It's interesting. We should watch it and follow it. But no, I don't think that's a very accurate description of what's happening.
Well, I think it's hard to, it's difficult for you to say that it's Israeli politics when the Brigadier General, who's head of the IDF currently, makes this kind of statement about the security of Israel. It seems to me that
you think that IDF officers don't engage in politics as well?
Well, I think there's so many of them. In fact, their whole association of the Israeli military passed a resolution during the consideration of the nuclear deal saying that they thought it would be okay to go along with this. This is not a single or just a handful of individuals. This seems to be the establishment. But I'd like to go on to another point, which is why I think it's far more important. It's not just a question of our alignment with Iran, but had we not been able to make that deal, there were several moments where Israel nearly launched an attack on Iran, and that would have started a cataclysmic situation. So I think the deal had a very, very profound effect on the potential for a major Middle East conflagration.
Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe. didn't start a major Middle Eastern conflict when the Israelis hit the Syrian nuclear facilities, or Iraq's either. Maybe. I'm saying you might be right, maybe not.
Country that has about 20,000 missiles that already do fire at Israel. So it's not minor. This is not a little back.
I know. I'm saying maybe.
We have another question over here.
Hi, I'm Bev Goldstein. I took a national security trip to Israel last year, and I stood on the border at Mishkav, right at the fence, looking at all that Hezbollah housing. It's sort of like an area without police, without any government control. They're just there. You could walk, if there was no fence, you could just walk it in 20 minutes. Then I put on a Stop Iran rally downtown in Cleveland. I was part of that national group that had Stop Iran rallies around the country. What bothered me the most about the deal is the release of the bank accounts and the incredible amounts of dollars that they really don't need internally in Iran that they can use for terrorism. I actually came to so I decided to file and run for Congress. So I'm a candidate to run for Congress.
Good luck. Congratulations. Nice.
So I really want to be part of the discussion in Washington. But the concern I had, I figure we can do things about that deal. We could get a whole new administration in there, and we could do a lot of different things. My view was that the release of the money was the greatest threat to Israel at this time, and I was wondering if you agreed with that, or you had another view on that issue on release of the money.
I don't know. There's lots of people who are of the opinion that. That money, I mean, look, I certainly believe it was a bad thing. I mean, yes, it was a part of the deal, but I believe it was a bad thing to give them that money, because certainly they're going to use a lot of that to support terror. And we know that it's backing, part of that they're using on the war in Syria. And there's some announcement today, somewhere in the Times of Israel, about the amount of money they're going to give to Palestinian suicide bombers and their families and stuff. Yes, they're certainly going to spend it on that. I mean, they're spending it on a renewed bounty on the head of Salman Rushdie. But there are other people who argue that even if it's, no matter what the sum is, and there are different opinions about what exactly the sum will be, is that the Iranian economy is still in a lot of trouble. And that, even if it's $150 billion, it's not going to save that economy. That economy is in really bad shape. And another thing that I think is not widely known, people are waiting. Europeans are not going in as quickly as people think they are, apparently. Because everyone is still very worried about what might happen with the next administration. If the next administration says, well, nope, the Iranians are not implementing this correctly, so no, we're going to reimpose these sanctions. And the Europeans are worried about that. So even though they're making a lot of ado about, different European companies going in, and I think that the Japanese and the Chinese will be active if they're not already as well, I think that a lot of people are still holding off. So that's just to say, I don't know exactly what the financial situation is like in Iran, but yes, certainly they're going to use that money for a lot of bad things.
I don't understand when you talk about Israel and nuclear Iran. Nuclear Iran said many times that the first bomb will be sent on Israel. Why it doesn't matter now?
I'm sorry.
Why it doesn't matter now? Why it is not important?
What doesn't matter? That
Iran will be nuclear.
I think that people still do believe that that's very important. I think that people are still extremely concerned about that. Pardon me? Oh, no. I said it's still very important. There are other pressing concerns. There are other things. I think the most important concern right now for Israel is what's happening on their border. And they want to keep the Iranians and Hezbollah off that border, where they might someday point rockets and missiles, as they do now from, actually not just from southern Lebanon, but from all of Lebanon. That's one of the issues in Lebanon. Every place in Lebanon can hit every place in Israel. And they don't want that happening from the Golan as well. So no, the prospect of a nuclear weapons program in the hands of the Iranians is still it's a very serious concern.
Can you comment on the chances, perhaps, of Turkey moving across the border into Syria to fight the Kurds, which apparently they might have done already, but actually, publicly moving across the border with troops? And then what the chances then of them getting into a hot conflict with Russia? And then if Russia and Turkey gets involved in a hot conflict, how does that affect us as a NATO, nation? Do you think that's a remote chance? Because the foreign minister,
the Turks have been pretty clear that they don't want to do that. They're saying stuff like, "No, that was never in the cards." Look, I think that we put Erdogan is a highly problematic figure in many, many ways. Nonetheless, I think it's important, as I said that before about Saudi, nonetheless, it's important when the Iranians attack the Saudi diplomatic facilities, when the Russians are sticking it to the Turks, this is only partly about the Turks, only partly about the Saudis. It's about us, right? So they're a NATO member. They're a NATO partner of ours, and I don't think we've done very well by them at all. So to answer the first part of that, I don't think the Turks are going to go in. They don't want to. There's certainly a lot of pressure, and things can get a lot worse between them and the Russians. How will that affect us? Again, I think it's going to depend on. It's a mess there, but again, it will depend on what the next administration wants to do. But I'm quite certain the next administration, they don't want that to be one of the first things they have to deal with. A Turkey-Russia shooting war. So, but I certainly think. But one of Putin's aims has been to weaken NATO, to keep showing that NATO's a paper tiger. This is part of it, I think.
Okay, I know there's a lot more people have questions, but I'm also keeping my eye on the clock and seeing some other people get restless. So we're going to do one more, and perhaps Lee will stick around a little bit for a few more private conversations.
How secure is the Saudi royal family? And taking a possible negative view, what forces would you expect to come forward?
In Saudi Arabia?
In Saudi Arabia.
The Saudi royal family, it's very, very big. Most of the stuff that happens, the fights within the Saudi royal family are between the members of the royal family, right? So there's all sorts of people who are watching what happens now with the crown prince, Mohammed bin Nayef, and Mohammed bin Salman, who's a deputy crown prince. So will there be ups and downs in the actual Saudi court? Maybe, but the actual regime, no. I think the regime is pretty stable. There's a lot of things that would have to happen to destabilize that regime. There would have to be a really coherent opposition. There's not one now. They'd also have to be in a lot of economic trouble for a long, long time. My sense is, from hearing people who know a lot more about this than I do, it's that there would have to be sustained low oil prices over the course of years. So, I think they're on pretty solid ground right now. Their bigger problem, I think, is not. It's not inside, it's on their border, right? On their border of Yemen. That's how they perceive it. That's a real issue. The president has said, no, the Saudis' biggest problem comes from their own societies, which they need to solve. Yeah, that's probably true. But that's also a tough way to talk about an ally. But the Saudis perceive their real threat, their real issue is Yemen.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Lee, thank you for being with us.